If you do this to an empath, they won't react loudly. They will simply start disappearing from your emotional world without a single warning. And you will never understand what went wrong. They won't raise their voice. They won't accuse you. They won't even tell you what's happening. But something will start to shift, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. And by the time you notice it, the connection you thought you had will already be changing. Because when it comes to empaths, control doesn't look like control. It looks like influence. Subtle, emotional, unspoken. And most people don't even realize they're doing it. Every emotional dynamic has a starting point. With empaths, that starting point is not logic. It's feeling. They don't connect based on surface behavior. They connect based on emotional alignment. How you speak, how you respond, how your presence feels, all of it matters more than your words. And this is where influence begins, not by forcing anything, but by creating a pattern they start to respond to. At first it feels natural, easy, effortless, almost automatic, because an empath doesn't resist connection. They lean into it. What most people miss is that empaths don't just feel emotions, they track patterns, not consciously, but consistently. Every shift in your tone, every delay in your response, every moment your behavior changes, gets registered, and over time, those small moments become a pattern. Now here's where it gets interesting. When your behavior becomes slightly inconsistent, not enough to break the connection, but enough to create subtle uncertainty, the empath starts adjusting, not because they're weak, but because they're trying to understand. They begin to mirror you, match your energy, correct the imbalance, and that's where influence quietly takes hold. At this stage, nothing looks wrong. There's no conflict, no confrontation, no obvious tension, but internally something is changing. The empath is becoming more aware of you, more focused on your responses, more sensitive to your presence. They start paying closer attention, not because they're trying to, but because something feels slightly off. And when something feels off to an empath, they don't ignore it. They move toward it. They try to understand it. They invest more attention, more energy, more emotional focus, without even realizing why. And the deeper this pattern goes, the harder it becomes for them to step back. Because what feels like connection is slowly becoming something else. Something they can feel, but can't fully explain. In the next part, we're going to break down something even more powerful. The moment when emotional pressure begins without a single word being said, because that's where the real shift happens. By this stage, the connection doesn't feel new anymore. It feels familiar, and that familiarity is where something subtle begins to change. Not loudly, not visibly, but emotionally, because now the empath is not just observing you. They are emotionally invested in you. And investment always changes perception. One of the most powerful forces in any empath dynamic is what is not said. You don't need to ask for support directly. You don't need to express need in a clear way, because subtle emotional signals are enough. A slight withdrawal, a quiet response, a tone that feels off. To most people, these are nothing. But to an empath, these become emotional responsibilities. They start to feel something is missing, even when nothing is said, and that missing feeling creates internal pressure. Not from you, from within them. This is where the shift becomes deeper. The empath starts to do something automatically. They begin to fill emotional gaps. If you are distant, they become more attentive. If you are quiet, they become more present. If you are inconsistent, they become more emotionally stable. Not because you asked, but because imbalance feels uncomfortable to them. And slowly, this creates a hidden dynamic. You give less, they adjust more, you withdraw slightly, they compensate emotionally. And over time, this creates a silent form of influence, not control through force, but control through emotional correction. At a certain point, even silence becomes communication. A delayed reply can feel meaningful. A short response can feel heavy. A lack of warmth can feel intentional. And this is where something subtle enters, emotional interpretation. The empath starts assigning meaning to your behavior, not because you said anything, but because patterns are forming. And when they feel they are not matching your emotional state, they begin to internally adjust. Sometimes that adjustment looks like overthinking, increased care, emotional self-correction, deeper attachment. But from the outside, nothing seems wrong. That's what makes it powerful. Now the dynamic shifts again. The empath is no longer just responding. They are anticipating. They start thinking ahead. What version of them will I get today? And this uncertainty creates a loop, because unpredictability increases attention. Attention increases emotional investment. And emotional investment increases attachment. Without realizing it, they are now more emotionally tuned into you than before, not because of what you did directly, but because of the pattern created between presence and distance. And here's where it becomes important. Because once someone starts adjusting to your emotional rhythm, they stop experiencing you neutrally. You become a reference point in their emotional system. This is not dependence in the obvious sense. It doesn't look like neediness. It looks like awareness. They start checking how you respond, how you feel, how you behave, what has changed, and slowly, your behavior begins to influence their emotional state, not through force, but through pattern recognition. This is the stage where emotional dynamics stop being equal and start becoming reactive, but what most people never realize is this is not the final stage. Because once emotional adjustment begins, something even deeper starts forming underneath it. And in part 3, we'll break the point where everything silently starts to break apart. At this point, something important starts to change. Not in you, but in them, because what once felt like connection now starts to feel like effort. And effort is where awareness begins. Empaths don't detach quickly. They observe first. They analyze quietly. They start connecting dots that were never spoken. A cold response here, a warm moment there, a sudden shift in attention. Individually, nothing matters. But together, they form a pattern. And once a pattern is formed, it can't be unseen. This is the stage where the empath stops asking, "What is happening?" and starts asking, "Why does this keep happening?" That question changes everything. Now something subtle happens. They don't react immediately anymore. They don't overinvest like before. They start conserving emotional energy, because inconsistency is exhausting. Not dramatic exhaustion, but internal fatigue, the kind that builds slowly. Every unclear moment, every emotional shift, every unanswered feeling adds weight. And that weight starts changing their behavior. Less excitement, less openness, less emotional availability. Not as punishment, as protection. This is where most people misunderstand what's happening. From the outside, everything looks normal. No fights, no arguments, no confrontation. But internally, something is pulling away. Responses become shorter, engagement becomes controlled, presence becomes selective. And most importantly, they stop trying to decode you emotionally, because decoding requires energy. And energy is no longer freely given. Now the shift becomes irreversible. The empath begins to separate what they feel from what they observe. And once that separation begins, emotion loses dominance. Logic starts entering the space. They begin to see you not as a feeling, but as a pattern. And patterns don't create emotional attachment. They create understanding, and understanding leads to distance. At this stage, the empath stops over-adjusting. They stop compensating for imbalance. They stop filling emotional gaps. And when that happens, the entire dynamic collapses internally. Because what was holding the connection together was their emotional investment, not yours. And when that investment reduces, the relationship starts to feel different instantly. Not broken, just emptying, and this is the part most people never see coming. Because nothing dramatic happens externally, but internally, the decision is already forming. Not to fight, not to fix, but to step back. And in part 4, we'll go into the final stage, when the empath fully disconnects, without explanation, without warning, and without return. At this point, something irreversible has already started. Not in the relationship, but in their mind, because emotional decisions don't happen at the end. They happen long before the ending becomes visible. And by now, the empath has already crossed that internal threshold, where staying requires more energy than leaving. The first sign is almost unnoticeable. They don't explain less. They don't react dramatically. They simply reduce presence, a slower reply, a shorter answer, a neutral tone where emotion used to be. And most people misread this moment. They think nothing is wrong. But internally, something important has already changed. They are no longer emotionally participating at the same level. This is not anger. This is not revenge. This is control. Because empaths don't explode outwardly. They turn inward first. They stop investing emotionally into confusion. They stop trying to fix inconsistency. They stop decoding emotional signals that never stabilize. And once that effort stops, Connection starts dissolving naturally. No conversation happens. No final warning is given. No dramatic moment defines it. Instead, a realization forms, this pattern is not changing. And that realization removes expectation. Once expectation is gone, attachment weakens instantly. Because attachment depends on hope, and hope depends on change. Without change, there is no emotional reason to stay engaged. This is where people get shocked, because from the outside, everything feels sudden. But internally, it has been building for a long time. Now they stop, explaining themselves, overthinking your behavior, adjusting to emotional inconsistency, investing energy into unclear patterns. And when that stops, you don't see anger, you see absence. Not loud absence, silent absence, the kind that doesn't ask for attention. And this is the most misunderstood part. When an empath fully disconnects, they don't do it halfway. They don't leave emotionally but stay physically attached. They remove access completely, not because of emotion, but because of clarity. Because once a pattern is understood fully, re-entry doesn't feel necessary, re-explaining doesn't feel valuable. And revisiting the same emotional cycle feels unnecessary. What looks like a sudden disappearance is actually a long internal process of observation, evaluation, and quiet emotional withdrawal. And by the time it becomes visible to you, they are already gone internally. Not in anger, not in reaction, but in understanding, because when an empath leaves, they don't leave loudly. They leave completely and silently, long before you ever notice.